My name is Morgan, and 2 decades ago, my father stared directly at me and declared, "You've made your bed. Now lie in it." That phrase still sears my memory. It was his final statement to me before the door slammed shut, abandoning me to the chill of a November evening, holding on to the new life within me that my family rejected. I was 19, pregnant, and gripped by fear. From that point forward, he ceased to see me as his daughter. I had become a disgrace. That evening, I can still picture the porch light casting a harsh glare that felt like a public spotlight on my shame. Behind my father, my older brother stood with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face as if he had triumphed in some heartless competition. "Don't you come begging to return," he sneered. I could hear my mother's muffled sobs from the kitchen window, but she never emerged. Perhaps she was unable to. Or maybe his presence simply frightened her too much. I felt the cold seep into my very being as I walked away from that porch, armed with only a duffel bag and the reverberation of his words pursuing me into the night. It's important to know that I was raised in a small Midwestern community where reputation was paramount. My father served as a deacon at our church. He was the type of person regarded as a cornerstone of the community. He wore his Sunday best like a suit of armor and wielded scripture as his weapon of choice. Yet, when it concerned me, his only daughter, he offered no compassion. I had tarnished his good name. For my brother, I had brought dishonor to our family. As I walked down that gravel drive, I knew I had been deprived of any kind of safety net. It was a feeling of complete exile. My first refuge was the couch of a friend. I can recall lying awake the entire night, a hand resting on my stomach, contemplating how I could ever manage to raise a child by myself. I considered phoning my mom, but each time my hand neared the phone, I envisioned my dad snatching it away. His voice still echoed in my mind, "Don't come crawling back." I refused to grant him the satisfaction of being correct, so I remained silent. During those initial weeks, I rapidly came to understand the true meaning of survival. I spent my days at a diner clearing tables until my back was in agony, and my nights were spent cleaning offices. My feet would swell, and my hands would crack from the bleach, but I never failed to show up. I secured a small studio apartment where the paint was flaking from the walls. The sink in the bathroom had a constant leak, and the heating was barely functional in the winter, yet it was all mine. And the baby growing inside me served as a constant reminder of why I could not surrender. Each kick and flutter affirmed that I was not by myself. It was no longer just me against the world, it was us. There is one moment that stands out in my memory. It was December, right before Christmas. A heavy snow was falling, and I had to walk back from the diner because the old car a neighbor had lent me refused to start. At 6 months pregnant, I was utterly spent, and my coat would hardly fasten around my belly. People hurried past, couples laden with shopping bags, laughing families, but none gave me a second glance. I collapsed onto a bus stop bench and wept more intensely than I ever had. That was my absolute lowest point. For a fleeting instant, I considered that perhaps my dad was right, that I had created this situation and deserved nothing but misery. But something inside me shifted that night. A stranger paused, a woman in her 60s with compassionate eyes. She didn't inquire about my tears. She simply took a seat beside me, offered me a thermos of hot tea, and said, "Honey, God never wastes pain." That single sentence cut through my despair. I have held onto it ever since. I came to see that I was faced with a choice. I could either allow bitterness to shape my life or I could strive to create something superior. That was when I began seeking a way forward. I enrolled in community college courses, paying for them with grants and loans. I joined Rock for the scholarships and the structure they provided. To be honest, I was in desperate need of both. Initially, it was exhausting. My body was already fatigued from the long work hours and the pregnancy. However, the discipline and the sense of camaraderie gave me a new sense of purpose. For the first time since being thrown off that porch, I felt a sense of belonging. The day my daughter was born, alone in that shabby apartment, I contemplated calling my parents. I thought that maybe the sound of their grandchild's cry might melt their hearts. But as I held my baby girl, her tiny fingers wrapping tightly around mine, I understood that I no longer required their validation. I gazed down at her and whispered, "We are going to be okay. Just the two of us." And I believed it with every fiber of my being. Those initial years were far from glamorous. I balanced diapers, late-night feedings, classes, and part-time employment. Some nights, I would fall onto the floor, too exhausted to even make it to bed. But each hardship made me stronger and more determined. I transformed into someone my father would not have recognized, someone more resilient than his rejection and tougher than his words. The young woman he had cast out was no more. A new woman was being forged in the crucible of adversity. In hindsight, I now view that first chapter of my life not as a tragedy, but as the catalyst for my transformation. It was the push that compelled me to find my own 2 feet. It was the wound that created the scar, the banishment that made the eventual return so meaningful. My father believed he had ruined my life that night. In reality, he had initiated a story that would one day bring him to his knees. I never understood the saving power of a routine until I had to construct one from the ground up. My days started with a second-hand coffee pot sputtering on the counter, the scent of burnt coffee mingling with baby powder and bleach. I would secure my daughter, Emily, in a stroller from a thrift store and walk her the 3 blocks to the woman who cared for her while I covered the breakfast rush at the diner. The small metal bell on the diner's door chimed the same tune each morning. I cleaned up ketchup spills, topped off coffee for men in camouflage hats, and mastered the art of smiling at customers who didn't bother to look up from their papers. Community college was a hazy memory of fluorescent lighting and cinder-block corridors. I attended classes in the evening, English composition, American history, and a public speaking class that filled me with dread. Rock sessions were at dawn on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I would drop Emily off before sunrise, murmuring apologies for waking her, and then run to campus with my backpack bouncing against my back. The physical training was a jolt to my system. I was still recovering from childbirth, and for the first few months, I was consistently at the rear of the group. But there was a tenacity in me that my father had underestimated. When my lungs felt like they were on fire, I would picture the porch light from that November evening and push myself to take one more step. There were individuals who influenced my life in subtle but significant ways. The woman with the thermos of tea had sown a seed of hope. At the diner, a retired gunnery sergeant named Walt began offering me advice along with his tips. He would say, as he addressed all women, always tie your boots the same. Discipline begins with your own 2 feet. He would leave a folded sticky note with lists, push-up routines, interval training schedules, and instructions on how to properly tape a blister. "You in rot?" he inquired one morning. I confirmed. "Good," he responded, and that was the extent of his lecture. Later, after I successfully completed my first PT test without getting sick, I left a complimentary slice of apple pie on his table. He left me a $5 tip and a smile that stayed with me all day. Finances were a persistent source of anxiety. I donated plasma twice a month after receiving a gas bill in February with an ominous red stamp. I spent one Tuesday afternoon at the Community Assistance Center, with Emily sleeping on my chest, while a caseworker detailed the distinction between a handout and a hand-up. I learned how to make a single rotisserie chicken last for 3 meals and how to mend a missing button using dental floss. I discovered the meaning of profound exhaustion, the kind where you reread a sentence 3 times and still fail to comprehend its meaning. Church was a delicate matter. My father's church was no longer mine. However, on Sundays, I discovered a small fellowship that gathered in a converted storefront situated between a laundromat and a payday loan office. There were no stained glass windows, only folding chairs and a pastor with a well-worn guitar. They didn't pry when I shed tears during the second hymn. A woman named Ruth, with her silver hair neatly pinned, started bringing me casseroles for no particular reason. On the evenings I was tempted to call my mother, I would instead bake cornbread for Ruth and express my gratitude more times than necessary. Rock taught me to carry myself as if I were someone of consequence. The first time I wore my uniform on campus, I looked at my reflection in a bathroom mirror and saw a stranger. My chin was up, and my shoulders were back. The instructors were not given to sentimentality. They focused on checklists, standards, and whether you arrived 5 minutes early. I began to yearn for that kind of predictability. If you put in the effort, you achieved the rank. No one could strip that away from you. I won't claim that I handled everything perfectly. I missed Emily's first steps because I was at a late-night session practicing land navigation in a steamy classroom. I neglected to sign a daycare permission slip and consequently lost our spot for a week. One night, while walking home with Emily asleep in her stroller, a police car pulled up beside me. The officer inquired if I was all right. I assured him I was. He seemed unconvinced and circled the block twice. I quickened my pace. When Emily turned 3, I submitted an application for an officer accession program that seemed designed for people from more privileged backgrounds, those whose family names carried weight. The application required an essay on resilience. I wrote about the bench in December, the thermos of tea, and the phrase, "God never wastes pain." I wrote about a deacon who informed his daughter that she was a disgrace to the family, and about a young woman who discovered that shame could be a powerful motivator. I wrote it all down, printed it at the library for 10 cents a page, and placed it in a manila envelope with hands that shook uncontrollably. The acceptance letter arrived in late spring. Emily was on the floor coloring, and the cartoon dog on the television was speaking in a voice that was grating on my nerves. I tore open the envelope and read the word "accepted" 3 times. It wasn't a cinematic moment, there was no swelling orchestra. I simply sat there, hugging my knees with the letter held to my chest, while Emily asked if we could have macaroni for dinner. "We can have whatever we want," I replied. And for the first time, that statement felt genuinely true. Training was a different level of difficulty. I left with a duffel bag and a vow to my daughter that I would return a better person. The days blurred together: reveille, chow, classes, field exercises, more chow, more studying, lights out, and then repeat. I learned to make my bed with corners so sharp they could cut. I mastered the terminology of maps, azimuth, cont line, resection. I learned to count my own heartbeats in the silence between commands. When a member of the cadre yelled at me for an error, I found that I could absorb the criticism, correct the mistake, and remain composed. There were challenges. During a ruck march in August, the sky opened up and released a downpour that felt like divine judgment. My boots were filled with water, and my socks chafed my heels until they were raw. I thought of my father with each step, and it no longer pained me. It drove me forward. A captain, with sharp eyes and a steady demeanor, fell in step beside me without a word, then remarked, "Finally. You have more in you than you realize." I cherished that sentence like a medal. On weekends, I would call home, the home that Emily and I had established in our base housing. She would tell me about preschool, about a classmate who refused to share the red crayon, and about a boy who ate dirt and claimed it tasted like cookies. When she inquired about my whereabouts, I would say, "I'm learning how to be strong." And she would reply, "Me too," in the voice of a child who imagines strength is a color one can simply select. By the time of my commissioning, I was no longer the woman on the bus stop bench. I stood in a crisp uniform, my hair secured back, with a small bar on my chest that symbolized the hours, blisters, and tears I had invested. Emily stood next to me in a blue dress that Ruth had found at a yard sale, clapping as if the entire ceremony was just for her. And in a sense, it was. I mailed my mother a photocopy of the commissioning photograph with a brief message, "I'm safe. We're okay." I did not send one to my father. I was not prepared to share any part of my pride with him. Pride had come at a high price, and I needed to keep it where I could always see it. There's a transformation that occurs when you endure the seemingly impossible for an extended period. The impossible starts to feel routine. I began each day with a to-do list and ended it with a list for the next. The posture became a habit, and the habit evolved into my identity. People began to seek me out for answers, and I learned how to provide them. And in the quiet moments between chow and lights out, a strange sense of peace settled over me, rooted in the knowledge that the girl my father had disowned had learned to command herself. I was uncertain of what the future held. I only knew one thing for sure: I would never again be subject to the tyranny of a porch light and a slammed door. I once believed that healing would manifest with a flourish, loud, clear, and marked by a banner proclaiming, "You have succeeded." It did not. Instead, it arrived subtly during mundane mornings, boots neatly arranged by the door, Emily buttering toast while singing the incorrect lyrics to "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," a stack of field manuals on the table with a grocery list tucked between the pages. Years have a way of smoothing over rough edges. The young woman who once sat shivering at a bus stop in December transformed into a woman who could confidently brief a room of colonels without a tremor in her voice. My initial assignments were the unglamorous kind that never make it into films: logistics, training pipelines, the essential but unexciting framework of military readiness. But that was my area of expertise, and I excelled in it. I learned to manage personnel and supplies with the precision of a chess master, to anticipate problems 3 steps ahead, and to deliver a firm no when a yes would compromise the system. I mastered the art of translating a whiteboard filled with arrows into a coherent plan. If there was one lesson life had taught me since I was 19, it was that plans are lifesavers. Emily grew with the resilience of a sapling in a tempest, somehow managing to stay upright. She was the type of child who would gather library cards from every base we relocated to, taping them like trophies inside a showbox. When she was 7, I discovered a crumpled note from her school in her backpack: "Bring your dad to lunch day, next Friday." For a moment, it threw me. I wrote a note to her teacher, asking if I could attend in my uniform. The day I entered that cafeteria, my boots silent on the wax tiles, heads turned and then quickly returned to their pizza squares. Emily held my hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This is my mom," she stated, without any hint of apology or explanation. That note also found its way into her showbox. If you are curious about my parents, the situation is complex. For many years, my father offered nothing but silence, like a road that had been washed away. My mother learned how to use email at the local library and would send me updates about the weather and whether her geraniums had survived the first frost. She never explicitly asked for forgiveness, she wrote as if she were trying to approach a timid bird without frightening it away. I would reply with photos: Emily in a thrift store Halloween costume, myself in a muddy training field pointing at a map, a cake with an excessive number of candles at a base housing party for a neighbor's 4-year-old son whose father was deployed. Ruth, the woman who brought me casseroles, once told me that when love has been damaged, it can sometimes resemble 2 lawn chairs placed side by side in silence. You sit, the other person sits, and the act of sitting together is the main point. My brother, Mark, sent a single Christmas card the year Emily turned 10. It was a glossy, staged photo of his family in matching sweaters at a Christmas tree farm. On the back, he had written, "Hope you're well." There was no return address. I placed it on the mantelpiece, then removed it when its presence started to unsettle me. I'm not sure why I had hoped for more from him. He had spent our entire childhood amassing our father's approval like a collection of baseball cards, always ready to display them. Some boys never grow out of that. I was promoted more quickly than I anticipated and more slowly than I desired. That's the nature of the military, it operates on a timeline you cannot control. The first time I was promoted to lieutenant colonel, Emily stood on her tiptoes to affix the pin, her hands trembling. She accidentally pricked me and gasped. "Sorry," she said. "It's good luck," I replied, and we both laughed because we needed the release. Later, after everyone had left and the sheet cake was reduced to crumbs on paper plates, I sat on the floor of our vacant quarters and gazed at the uniform hanging on the closet door. It felt heavier than mere fabric. There were difficult years as well. I dedicated a part of myself to my career that cannot be quantified on a resume. This is not a unique experience for me. Anyone who has served understands that the personal costs are never fully balanced. But these are the kinds of sacrifices that cannot be adequately described in a letter home: sleepless nights, the burden of decisions that affect other families' lives, the names you carry with you like heavy stones in your pocket. If you are reading this and are over 60, you understand what it means to have lived a full life yet still feel like you are 20 in some corner of your heart. The body remembers, and so does the soul. By the time Emily was nearing the end of high school, she reminded me of a sailboat that had learned to catch the wind from any direction. She took a part-time job at the base library and would come home with tales of retirees who organized books according to their own preferences rather than the Dewey Decimal System, and of a widower who repeatedly checked out the same Louis L'Amour paperback, as if hoping for a different ending if he asked politely. Some evenings, over a meatloaf that wouldn't slice neatly, she would tilt her head and ask, "Do you ever think about going back?" "Back where?" "Home." I would give my standard reply, "I made a new one." Then I would shift the conversation to her calculus homework. It was during this period that I learned to accept the silence on my phone. My mother would call occasionally, her tone awkward yet sincere. She once mentioned that she had stood up during a Bible study and confessed aloud that she had failed her daughter. No one said a word, she whispered. They just handed me the Kleenex. I didn't know what to do with that confession, so I placed it gently between us and said, "Thank you." It was a narrow bridge, just 2 planks wide, but it held. The day the flag officer selection list was released, I didn't jump for joy or weep. I simply stared at my name, Morgan M., until the letters became a blur. A 1-star rank is a peculiar thing. It isn't a medal you can polish, it's a mirror that reflects every individual who helped you stay standing: Walt with his sticky notes and blister tape, Ruth with her casseroles, the officer who told me I had more in me than I realized, and a teacher who gave me a B+ on a speech because my hands wouldn't stop shaking and then stayed after class to help me practice until they did. I shared the news with Emily first. She shrieked, then cried, then laughed, the way big news tends to unfold in a kitchen. The promotion came with a house I never anticipated living in, brick and glass, with a gate and more rooms than we required. People often think the military is all about barracks and base housing. Sometimes, it's a key placed in your hand by a stranger who says, "This is yours for the time being. Take good care of it." I had to hire help because the demands of the job would have consumed me otherwise: a housekeeper twice a week and a man named Albert who managed the gatehouse and carried himself like a retired umpire. He addressed everyone as "Sir" and including the golden retriever from 2 doors down who greeted him like a long-lost relative. We never referred to him as a butler, he called himself the keeper of lists. He was the kind of person who would iron a tablecloth with the same care as if putting a child to bed. December arrived, and the world adorned itself in soft, festive lights. We were organizing a small reception for soldiers, spouses, a chaplain who was a better storyteller than a preacher, and a few neighbors who knew to remove their boots without being asked. The invitations were intentionally simple: white cardstock with my name, a date, a time, and a request to bring canned goods for the local food pantry, as the lines there grew longer with the nights. I watched the pile of RSVPs accumulate in a silver bowl by the front door and felt a quiet sense of contentment, not quite pride, but more like a feeling of stability. A week before the reception, my phone rang with a number I hadn't saved but recognized instantly. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, I answered. "Morgan." It was my mother's voice, sounding smaller than I remembered. "Hi, Mom." There was a long pause, the kind of breath a person takes when their words are difficult and they are trying to soften them. "Your father, he's not doing well." She continued quickly, as if trying to outpace the rest of her sentence. "He's as stubborn as ever, but he listens to the doctor more than he ever listened to me." I expressed my sympathy, because I genuinely felt it. Illness doesn't negate past wrongs, but it does make everyone human again. She didn't ask for anything, not even an invitation. She simply said, "I've told him about Emily. I've told him about you." The silence that followed her words felt like a porch light switching on in a distant universe. "If you ever wanted to see us," she added, "we could visit for a short while. Your brother could drive." I imagined Mark adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror of a car that smelled of dealership air freshener and judgment. I pictured my father clutching the armrest, his righteous anger dwindling like a failing battery. I told my mother I would consider it. Then I stood in my kitchen for a considerable time, my hands flat on the counter, allowing 2 decades of resentment and forgiveness to circle each other like exhausted dogs. The truth was, I didn't know which version of myself would answer the door if they arrived: the one who had slept on a bus stop bench in December, the officer who could bring order to a chaotic battlefield, or the daughter who still occasionally woke up at 2 a.m. with a racing heart because of a sentence a man had once uttered that felt like a final judgment. I made tea, as one does when the next step is unclear. I set out 2 cups, then returned one to the cupboard. I wrote a name on the guest list in small, precise letters, guest of the general family. Then I crossed it out and wrote it again, larger. Albert would need to know who to admit through the gate. People think that major decisions are made on grand stages. More often, they are made in kitchens with a pen that doesn't write smoothly. That evening, I called Emily, who was away at college, and informed her that her grandmother might be visiting. "Do you want them to be here?" she asked, old enough now to understand that forgiveness offered to please others quickly sours. "I want a new beginning," I replied, surprising myself. "We can always decide on an ending later." She was silent for a moment, then said, "I'll be there for the reception. I can stand by your side." And just like that, the burden felt a little lighter. The following morning, I had a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was more composed this time. "We'll be driving down on Saturday," she said. "We won't cause any trouble. If you change your mind, just don't answer the gate." It wasn't a manipulative tactic, it was an act of mercy for both of us. Albert came to my home office with his ledger. "Are you expecting any special guests?" He had a way of saying special that made it sound like a carefully mended quilt. I looked at his organized columns and my own name at the top, and my thoughts drifted back to that bus stop and that porch. "Yes, Albert," I said at last. "Please add family. He clicked his pen, wrote the entry with care, and closed the book as if putting a story to bed for the night. "Very good," he said. "We'll be prepared at the gate." Saturday dawned with a sense of anticipation. The house was unusually quiet in the morning, a silence that felt almost sacred. I walked the grounds at sunrise, my coffee growing cold in my hand, inspecting the small details that go unnoticed unless they are amiss: the wreath centered on the front door, the lights along the brick walkway, the flag at the proper height and not faded. Albert had placed poinsettias in substantial clay pots and had polished the brass bell at the gatehouse until it gleamed like a newly minted coin. "Ready for company," he announced, and I gave a nod like a commanding officer reviewing his troops. I had planned to keep myself occupied with work until they showed up: emails, briefing materials, the reception schedule, anything to keep my hands from being idle. Instead, I found myself in the pantry, counting votive candles as if the correct number could somehow calm my racing heart. Emily sent a text from the road, 40 minutes away. "Got those cinnamon rolls you like?" I responded with a thumbs up and a red heart emoji, then put my phone down, as it suddenly felt too heavy to hold. By 11, the winter sky had turned a pale, high blue that seemed to amplify every sound. A squirrel chattered from the oak trees. In the distance, a leaf blower started and then stopped. I heard the click of the gate intercom in the kitchen, 2 short beeps, the sound of Albert's line. He said, his voice low, as if we were in a sacred space. "They are here." I didn't rush to the window. I remained where I was, smoothing the front of my sweater as if to remove invisible wrinkles. By force of habit, I checked the time, 11:03, and then composed myself, shoulders back, chin up, breathe from the diaphragm. It's strange how habits from the parade ground follow you into your own kitchen. I walked into the foyer and paused beside the bowl of RSVPs. The pile had become thick and celebratory, with names written in various scripts. I randomly picked one up, Chaplain Moore and Guest, and traced the curves of the capital M with my thumb. The doorbell chimed, not the one at the front door, but the gatehouse bell. Albert had a way of ringing it that was both polite and firm, 2 notes that conveyed attention, please, without being loud. I stepped out onto the front porch, the wooden boards clean and warmed by the sun. From that vantage point, I could see down the driveway, the wrought iron gates standing open like the curtains of a stage, Albert in his dark suit with the ledger tucked under his arm, and beyond him, a silver SUV idling, its turn signal blinking. Another car, a daily rental with a plastic tag hanging from the rearview mirror, waited behind it. I descended the brick steps at a deliberate pace, the sound of my own feet crunching on the gravel, and stopped near the magnolia tree, where a pocket of cool air lingered in the shade. I didn't want to meet them halfway like a supplicant, nor did I want to make them walk the entire distance like petitioners. Somewhere in between felt appropriate. Albert, ever precise, even from a distance, raised a hand in a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. I could see that he had already calculated the delicate balance of tension and courtesy and had chosen a course that would not disrupt either. He opened the passenger door of the SUV. My mother emerged from the car, handling her purse and her breath with care. She was wearing a wool coat I remembered from a lifetime ago, navy blue with buttons that had once belonged to my grandmother. Her hair was shorter and grayer, and her lips were set in what was trying to be a smile. Her gaze swept past the yard and the bare winter trees until it found me, with the unerring certainty of a mother who has always known where to look first. My brother exited from the driver's side, his sunglasses too dark for the overcast day, his jaw tight. He had grown to resemble our father in profile, the sharp line of his nose, the habit of standing with his feet set too far apart, as if staking a claim to the ground. He leaned against the car door, as if it could support him in whatever narrative he had brought with him. In the second car, a figure moved in the back seat, my father, and then stilled, as if even that small motion had cost him something he was unwilling to part with. He remained in the car. Albert glanced at his ledger and then at them, his politeness serving as a shield. He gestured toward the gatehouse window, where a small brass plaque was displayed, "Guests, please check in." "Good morning," he said. "Are you here to see General Morgan?" It was the gentlest of questions, delivered with the care of a napkin being placed under a glass, yet it landed with the finality of a gavel. My mother's hand flew to her throat. Mark's sunglasses slid down his nose, as if gravity itself wanted him to see the situation clearly. In the back seat, my father turned his head toward the voice. The words lingered in the cold winter air, suspended between them, the fence, and the intervening years. For a moment, there was complete silence. You never realize how deafening silence can be until you are in the midst of it. My mother was the first to regain her composure. "Yes," she said, her words directed not at the gate, the house, or even me in the distance, but at the universe that had finally rewritten a sentence she had been too afraid to utter. "We are here to see our daughter." Albert gave a slight nod. "Very good." He stepped aside, his courtesy paving a path before anyone had figured out how to walk it. The gate, responding to a switch he seemed not to touch, swung open wider. I started down the driveway, the wind catching the edge of my scarf, and met them at the point where the gravel transitioned to pavement. Up close, the passage of years was more apparent on all of us, new lines around our eyes, old hurts still living beneath the surface. My mother reached for me and then hesitated, her hands hovering like birds uncertain of their landing spot. I spared her the indecision and stepped into her embrace. The wool was scratchy against my cheek, and her perfume was the same drugstore floral that could make a kitchen smell like springtime in the middle of winter. "I am so sorry," she whispered into my shoulder, the word small, fierce, and both too late and perfectly on time. "I should have come after you. I should have." Her words trailed off. I held her more tightly for the ones she couldn't find. Over her shoulder, my brother stood, awkward, handsome, and caught off guard. "Morgan," he said, the syllables sounding foreign on his tongue. He glanced back at the second car, where our father was still seated, and for the first time, there was no smirk to borrow, no audience to impress. He looked like a young man who had lost his place in a play and didn't know how to admit it. "Mark," I replied. It's striking how a name spoken without any underlying weight can diffuse a tense situation. The back door opened slowly. My father swung his legs out, planted his feet deliberately, and rose in stages, as if accounting for every joint. He had lost weight. The air of authority that used to precede him into a room was no longer his scout. He was simply himself, and yet not. His eyes met mine, much like a person might gaze at a horizon that had shifted while they weren't looking. He took 3 steps forward and then stopped. I could see the mental calculations, the old rule book in his head that had no chapter on how to approach a daughter you had exiled, who now held a rank that surpassed every story you had ever told about yourself. He opened his mouth and then closed it. His hands, the same hands that had pointed, preached, and pounded on the kitchen table, were empty. I spoke first, because someone had to. "Thank you for coming," I said. The sentence felt like clean water, no sweetness, no bitterness, just the simple truth. My father's mouth fumbled for a response. "General," he said, as if trying on a coat that was not his size. Then, more quietly, "Morgan." It wasn't an apology, it was an act of reorientation. He needed to place me in his world before he could even consider expressing remorse. Albert, who could read a room like a map, offered my mother his arm. He said, "There's tea inside if you'd like to warm up." The gratitude my mother felt for that sentence could have illuminated the entire wreath. Mark nodded toward the gatehouse ledger, as if numbers could offer him salvation. My father's gaze shifted from the house to me, then to the ground, never settling long enough to establish a claim. We walked up the driveway together, with the awkwardness of people who share a past but not a present rhythm. The crunch of gravel under our feet marked the time. Just then, Emily's car pulled in, a box of cinnamon rolls on the passenger seat, her face so bright it made me feel both 16 and timeless. She parked, got out, and assessed the scene with a single glance, a skill that children of complicated families learn early. She walked directly to my mother and said, "Hi, Grandma. I'm Emily." My mother's hand flew to her mouth and then to Emily's cheek, as if to confirm both her existence and her warmth. You're lovely," she stammered. "You look just like." She caught herself before saying "me," as humility had finally found her. The winter sun had risen high enough to make the brick of the house glow. The soft tinkling of a neighbor's wind chimes created a melody that didn't follow any tune but made one nonetheless. We reached the porch. I held the door open, the wood heavy and familiar in my hand, and my family, cautious, humbled, and curious, stepped into a house they had likely pictured as a ruin but found to be a sanctuary. Before I followed them inside, I turned back and saw Albert standing at the gate, the ledger held close to his side, looking proud, protective, and perfectly composed. He met my gaze and gave the slightest of nods, the kind one sentry might give another at the end of a long watch. I returned the gesture. Inside, the warmth rose gently from the floor vents, carrying the scents of cinnamon, coffee, and something that felt like peace. The day had just begun, and already, a sentence that had once been a verdict had been answered by a question at a gate. "Are you here to see General Morgan?" Yes. Yes, they were. I hadn't intended for the afternoon to be a formal event. It was meant to be a simple reception, the kind of gathering that fills a house with coats draped over banisters and the sound of people reconnecting in kitchens. But a uniform has a way of turning an ordinary room into a silent observer. I went upstairs to change, not to make a point, but because I wanted the truth of my life to be visible. The jacket was laid out on the bed, perfectly pressed, the silver star on my shoulder catching the winter sunlight. Next to it was a small box containing Ruth's pearls. As I fastened them, I thought of the casserole dishes she used to line up on my counter during that first year, and how compassion is sometimes delivered in Pyrex. When I descended the stairs in my dress uniform, the chatter in the room subsided, much like it does when a hymn begins unannounced. The chaplain stood a little straighter. Emily's eyebrows raised in a private smile that seemed to say, "There she is." My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and tears welled up, the way they do when someone finally sees the truth of something they had only hoped for. Mark stared at the insignia on my uniform, as if its geometry could somehow explain the years that separated us. My father remained standing a moment longer than everyone else, his chin tilted back, taking in the precise cut of the fabric, the ribbons he didn't recognize, and the deliberate simplicity of a life defined by service rather than speeches. "Lunch is served in the dining room," Albert announced, his voice gentle, as if he were mediating a peace treaty. People began to move toward the ham biscuits, deviled eggs, and a punch bowl that shimmered like a welcoming pond. The chaplain asked if he could offer a prayer. As we bowed our heads, I felt my mother's fingers lightly touch the back of my hand, a question she didn't know how to articulate. I turned my palm upward and let her hold on. After their "Amen," Walt hobbled in on his bad knee, carrying a tin of cookies and a grin wide enough to dispel any storm. "Gunny," I said, and he gave me a two-fingered salute and a wink, as old Marines reserve the right to be playfully irreverent. He noticed the star on my shoulder, looked satisfied, and placed his tin next to the cinnamon rolls as if plotting coordinates on a map. "Brought the good kind," he said. "The kind so sweet, sugar forgets to be sorry." Neighbors arrived. A young captain from down the block balanced a baby on one hip and a plate on the other. A sergeant major handed Emily an envelope and said, "For the library. Tell them it's for the large print Westons," and I thought of her showbox filled with library cards. For a few minutes, it felt like any other December afternoon in a house that had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the season, coats off, stories shared, and the clatter of forks creating a kind of music. Then, the bell rang, and the front door opened to a gust of cold air and a sea of white hats, midshipmen from the Academy's Glee Club, in town for a performance, dropping off canned goods as the chaplain had requested. They entered, their cheeks flushed, suddenly realizing they had stumbled into a room filled with high-ranking officers. The senior midshipman stiffened upon recognizing me and delivered a sharp that echoed off the crown molding. The room quieted. I raised a hand in that subtle, permissive gesture that teaches a young leader how to be both professional and approachable. "At ease," I said. "Leave the beans by the pantry, then get yourselves a plate." My father watched them file past, like a river he no longer knew how to navigate. He glanced at Mark as if to say, "Do you see this?" and then at me, as if asking for an explanation I couldn't provide in a single sentence. So, I offered him a slice of apple from the platter and the chance for a conversation. People formed a line for the food. I overheard the chaplain telling my mother about the downtown pantry and how the number of people needing assistance had doubled since the local plant had closed. "She keeps it well stocked," he said, nodding in my direction. "No one knows how, because she won't let us mention her name." My mother pressed her lips together, a look she gets when gratitude is too immense to be expressed. Mark gravitated toward the mantel, studying the photographs as if they might reveal some secret about me. Field exercises in the pouring rain, Emily at a science fair with flour on her cheek, me in a hard hat at a groundbreaking for a new clinic, a grainy picture of the storefront church with its folding chairs and tilted cross. "So," he said at last, "you really accomplished all of this." It wasn't a statement of admiration or spite, it was a simple inventory. I let the word "yes" suffice. My father picked up a deviled egg and then set it back down. He cleared his throat and adopted the voice he used at church gatherings. "Well," he said, a little too loudly, "we all make errors. What's important is that we..." He trailed off, searching for a moral that would fit his new reality. "We move forward." The room registered his words, rooms always do. The chaplain's expression softened. Walt put down his cookie. Emily grew still. I could feel my mother's fingers tightening on my palm from a moment ago, even though we were no longer touching. Old patterns re-emerged on my father's face: control, revise, absolve. I felt the past pulling at me, but I refused to be drawn in. I placed my plate on the sideboard and turned to face him. "No," I said, not harshly. "We don't just move on. We start by telling the truth." The silence in the room shifted. It wasn't the heavy, accusatory kind, but rather an attentive silence, the way a congregation leans in when a testimony is about to be shared. "The truth," I went on, "is that you sent me away that night without a coat, and I learned to find warmth by building a life that didn't need your approval. The truth is that Mom showed her love through emails she typed with 2 fingers. The truth is that Mark and I turned away from each other because it was simpler than confronting you. The truth is that the hungry are fed better at the pantry in December, not because you preached about giving, but because this community shows up with paper bags and a sense of humility." My father's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked down at his hands as if the script might be written there. When he looked up, the room had reconfigured itself around the reality he had long avoided: his daughter, in a uniform he had not earned for her, surrounded by a community he had not built, standing on a floor he had not maintained. He had a choice, to be small or to be honest. "I was wrong," he said finally, their words heavy as stones but offered like bread. I was cruel. I believed I was defending something that didn't require defense. Or perhaps I was just protecting myself. He swallowed hard. I am sorry. He didn't weep or break down. He simply stood and spoke the truth, which was its own form of repentance. My mother made a sound I had never heard before, a mixture of relief and grief, and took his hand. The chaplain cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, "I'd like to say a word." He didn't so much wait for permission as ask the room to be still. There are apologies that sound like public relations, and there are apologies that sound like prayer. I just heard the latter. He turned to me. "General, would you permit an old preacher to praise you for a moment?" He didn't wait for my response to that either. "Friends, this woman has kept our pantry supplied for 2 winters and has never allowed me to put her name in the bulletin. She established a scholarship in Ruth's name because casseroles once sustained a young mother. She has sent children to summer camp and purchased boots for recruits who had nothing but a dream. If you're looking for a sermon, you are standing in the middle of one." I felt a flush creep up my neck, that familiar discomfort of being singled out. I shook my head slightly, but he wasn't incorrect. Walt chuckled, wiping his eye with a knuckle. "Told you discipline begins with your own 2 feet, he said to no one in particular." Across the room, one of the midshipmen, earnest and eager, set down his plate and, more out of instinct than protocol, stood at attention, facing me. Others followed, a ripple of straightening spines. The sergeant major placed his coffee on the mantel. People who had never served in the military stepped back and fell silent, not out of any command, but because witnessing true honor can change your posture. "Please, don't," I murmured, as I am wary of public displays. But the moment was less about me and more about what was being witnessed. My mother seeing her daughter honored for the very life she had feared would be her ruin, my father seeing a room align itself not to condemn him, but to affirm the truth he had finally spoken. I took a breath and let the silence build and then recede. I didn't return to gloat, I said, my voice steady, the words I had been holding all afternoon. I came back to see if a family could be different. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the room. A Christmas carol drifted in from a neighbor's speaker, and it felt fitting that the lyric I caught was, "Let every heart prepare him room." I turned to my father. "I don't forget," I said, offering him the dignity of honesty. "But I can forgive." I looked at Mark. That applies to brothers who didn't yet know how to be brothers. His jaw tensed, but for once, he didn't resist an offer of mercy. Emily came to my side and slipped her hand into mine, small and strong. "We have cinnamon rolls," she announced into the charged atmosphere, "because my daughter knows how to land a plane." Laughter shattered the tension into manageable pieces. People began to move again. Plates clinked. The midshipmen, abashed by their own show of reverence, descended upon the deviled eggs. My mother touched the star on my shoulder as if it were a sacred relic and whispered, "You are beautiful." My father gave a single nod, like a man removing his hat in a holy place. The house returned to its normal rhythm, but something within it had been mended. It wasn't a victory, or even justice in the strictest sense. It was alignment. A verdict had been answered by a life, and that life had made space for grace. After the dishes were cleared and the last midshipman had departed with a "thank you," the house settled into the gentle exhaustion that follows a party. Albert moved platters to the kitchen like a chess master clearing the board after a checkmate. The chaplain embraced my mother and left with a promise to send over a list of hymns for the Christmas Eve service. Walt tapped his injured knee and announced he would see himself out before anyone could protest. The sergeant major left the library donation on the sideboard with a note that read, "For Emily's readers, keep the stories going." I led my parents and Mark to the smaller sitting room off the foyer. It's the most tranquil space in the house, with no television, just books and a window overlooking the magnolia tree. The winter sun had softened, hidden behind a layer of clouds like washed wool. Steam rose from the mugs Albert had set down, peppermint tea for my mother, black coffee for my father, and water for Mark, who looked like a man in a suit trying to stay composed. Emily brought in a plate of cinnamon rolls and then left us with the quiet discretion of someone who understands that families need privacy to reshape themselves. My mother reached for my hand and held it. "I said it in there," she whispered, "but I want to say it again where it can be heard properly. I failed you." I shook my head, not to dismiss her need to confess, but because the word "failed" seemed too simplistic for what fear does to a person in a marriage built on rigid rules. "You were scared," I said. "So was I. The difference is, I had to find my way through it." Her grip tightened. "I was brought up to believe that a woman's virtue lies in her obedience," she said, her voice firm. "I forgot that love sometimes requires us to challenge flawed beliefs." Mark cleared his throat as if preparing to express an emotion. "I should have reached out," he said, looking at the floor, which confirmed his sincerity. "I convinced myself you were better off without the drama. Mostly, I just repeated what Dad told me." He glanced at our father and then back at his own hands. "That you had made your bed." He shrugged, a boy in a man's coat. "I made my choice, too. I chose the easy path. I'm sorry." There was no need to add any nuance. I let his apology rest on the table between us like an offering and said, "Thank you." My father remained silent for a long time, holding his coffee with both hands as if warming himself by a fire. When he finally looked up, his old preacher's cadence was gone. "I used to think that righteousness demanded harshness," he said. "I thought I had to make you understand the consequences of your sin." He closed his eyes for a moment, an old man trying to erase an old script. "It turns out, I only showed you the consequences of mine." He raised his head. "I don't know how to repair what I've broken." The sentence was steady, which made it stronger. "You can't repair it," I said, not unkindly. "We can only acknowledge the truth of it and decide how to proceed from here." He nodded, accepting the limitations as a lesson. "I want to get to know my granddaughter properly," he said. "If she is willing." I could have made him earn that opportunity, could have presented him with a list of conditions as long as the years I had spent earning my own peace. But mercy, when hoarded, tends to spoil. "She already knows who you are," I said. "She knows the entire story. It is as much a part of her as it is of any of us." Emily must have been listening from the hallway, because she appeared then, as if summoned by the word "granddaughter." She sat across from my father, her posture open, with the cautious kindness of someone who has been raised to be courageous. "Hi," she said. "I like how Grandma describes the weather. She uses words like spitting and blustery. My mother laughed softly and pressed a napkin to the corner of her eye. My father attempted a smile that seemed unsure of where to land. "I used to do the weather report on the local radio," he said, surprising us all. "Your grandma would let me know if I said, 'chance of showers' too many times in 1 week. Emily nodded, as if filing this small detail away. "You're welcome to report on our weather anytime," she said. "We could use more words for snow." We continued to talk like that for a while, not about the night on the porch or the years that followed, or the award ceremonies in base housing and the long tally of absences, but about small, ordinary things that carried weight: the price of eggs, the church potluck schedule, the fact that the library offers free coloring pages on Fridays. It wasn't avoidance, it was building a foundation. Sometimes you have to construct a conversation that can support a heavier load. When the light began to fade into late afternoon, my mother announced that we should leave before the roads got icy. She stood, hesitated, and then did the most courageous thing I saw her do all day. She took my father's hand and placed it in mine, a solemn, deliberate transfer of something I couldn't quite name. "Please, let us come for Christmas." The words were simple and yet immeasurably significant. I didn't respond immediately. All my trained instincts, the command voice, the ability to triage a situation, the skill of moving a room toward a decision, receded and allowed something older to speak. "Yes," I said, "but on my terms." I looked at my father. "No sermons, no revisions of history. We will set one plate at a time and tell one true story at a time." His shoulders relaxed, like a soldier standing at ease. "Understood," he said. At the door, Mark paused. Do you remember that game we used to play in the yard? The one with the chalk lines and the broomstick? Of course, I did. We were poor enough back then to fashion a game of baseball from whatever we could find in the garage. You always managed to hit it over the hedge, he said. I always claimed you were cheating. He swallowed. You weren't. It was the closest he could come to saying, I looked up to you, and perhaps even, I was intimidated by your strength. We shook hands like two men who had just set down their arms. They drove off, their turn signal blinking, their silence now reconfigured into something that, with care, might grow into peace. Albert closed the gate and returned to the porch, the day's ledger tucked under his arm. All accounted for, he said. I smiled, because he was right, and because some sentences can be both true and gentle. That night, after the dishes were done, I stood on the back steps with a mug of tea, watching my breath form and dissipate like speech bubbles in a winter comic. Emily joined me, wearing a sweatshirt that had made its way from my closet to hers. How are you feeling? She asked. I was candid. Tired, I said. And lighter. She bumped my shoulder with hers. I kept thinking, please don't let this story consume my mom. But it didn't. You consumed it. We stood there, letting the moonlight soften the darkness. Before going to bed, I opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside was the rock acceptance letter, a library card from a long-closed base, the first photo of me in a uniform that didn't quite fit, and a snapshot of Emily at 2, wearing a saucepan as a helmet. I added something new, today's guest list, with family written in Albert's neat script. You keep records of mercy the same way you keep tax receipts, because one day you might need to show your work. On Sunday, I called the pantry director and doubled our December donation. I wrote a check to the storefront church and asked Ruth's pastor to use it for whatever brought a sense of grace to a kitchen. Then I sat at the dining room table and wrote 3 notes, one to my mother, one to Mark, and one to my father. I didn't use metaphors or preach. I wrote logistics. Arrive at 3. Wear warm coats. Bring one story you are prepared to tell truthfully. Emily sealed the envelopes with a flourish. Like a magician completing a trick. On Christmas Eve, my daughter would ring their doorbell with a gift. I hadn't decided yet if it would be a framed photograph, a folded letter, or simply an invitation to sit together without any defenses. I only knew it would be something a family could hold with both hands. I turned off the lights, the house creaking as it cooled, and stood for another minute at the window. The magnolia leaves were dark circles against the night sky. In the distance, a siren wailed, rose, and then fell silent. I said a short prayer that was mostly thank you, with a little bit of help me. Then I slept, the kind of deep sleep you earn when you stop replaying a wound and start building a future. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle quiet, as if the entire town had collectively decided to speak in whispers. The sky was the color of pewter, and the air carried the crisp, metallic hint that snow was on its way if we were just patient. I woke up before my alarm, the way one does on the morning of a day that has been long in the making. Downstairs, the lights on the Christmas tree twinkled like small, persistent stars. Albert had already prepared the coffee and lined the mantel with small brown paper bags for the food pantry, each one neatly labeled in his block lettering, beans, rice, pasta. Emily came down, her hair in a loose knot, and handed me a mug without speaking. We stood side by side, watching the living room slowly fill with warmth. Are you ready? She asked, her voice soft and fitting for the season. I'm not sure, I admitted, being honest. But I think we are. We spent the morning as countless other families across the country do, monitoring timers, engaging in a light-hearted dispute over oven space, and ironing a tablecloth that was destined to wrinkle as soon as the first plate was set down. I took the ham out of the oven and listened to it sizzle. Emily arranged oranges and peppermint sticks in a bowl, as she believes bowls should look like invitations. I set up the small nativity scene I've taken with me from base to base, the one with the chipped camel and the Joseph whose staff is glued on at an angle. It holds no monetary value, but it is a part of our story. At noon, I called my mother. We're leaving in 20 minutes, she said, her voice bright and steady, like someone who had practiced being courageous. I thanked her for the heads up and sent a text to Albert. He responded with a thumbs up and a Santa emoji, which from him was the equivalent of a salute. They arrived at 2:47, early by our family's usual standards, which I chose to interpret as a sign of progress. I heard the gatehouse bell, then the sound of tires on the gravel, followed by the soft closing of car doors. I stepped out onto the porch. My mother's scarf was vibrant enough to be considered an expression of optimism. Mark was carrying a pie with a lattice crust, like a baked apology. My father wore his best coat, the one that carried the faint sense of cedar and old church hymns. "Welcome," I said, and I truly meant it. Inside, the house played its role perfectly. Warmth rose from the floor vents, the tree lights blinked, and the scent of cinnamon wafted from the kitchen. Emily met them at the door with 3 small envelopes, each addressed in her careful, looping script. "For later," she said, handing them out. "No peeking." We had an early dinner, as families often do when anticipation masquerades as hunger. The ham sliced effortlessly, as if it understood its purpose. My mother praised the green beans and then confessed that she preferred them cooked to a soft mush, the way her own mother used to make them. Mark helped himself to a second serving without a word, which I took as a high compliment. My father ate with the concentration of a man who had finally studied for his exam. After we had cleared the table, Emily stood and cleared her throat with mock seriousness. "All right," she announced, "house rules for story time." She raised a finger. 1. No sermons. A second finger. 2. No revising history. A third. 3. Truth first, with kindness close behind. She glanced at me. "That's what you said." I smiled at the version of myself she reflected back to me, edited and softened. But essentially unchanged. We moved into the sitting room. The magnolia tree outside was a dark silhouette, and the first snowflakes began to drift past the window like lazy confetti. Emily distributed the envelopes. On the count of 3, she instructed, we opened them together. She counted, we tore them open, and 3 photographs fell into 3 laps. It was my commissioning day from 20 years ago, with a small, resolute Emily beside me in her blue yard sale dress. My hair was pulled back, and my smile was hesitant but genuine. My mother's hand went to her chest. Mark drew in a sharp breath. My father, God bless him, reached out with a fingertip and traced the outline of the silver bar on my shoulder in the photograph, as if his touch could transcend time. "I wish I had been there," he said. The statement was not a plea for forgiveness, it was an offering of regret. "You weren't," I replied, "because facts are a necessary foundation." But she was. I nodded toward my mother, who had started to cry in the way some people pray, quietly and persistently into a tissue that stood no chance. I took her hand. "You found the words when you were able. That matters." We took turns sharing stories. Mark recounted the chalkline baseball game we had remembered at the door, the day he had accused me of cheating because I kept hitting the ball over the hedge, where the neighbor's dog would treat it like a hidden treasure. "You weren't cheating," he said again, this time with a grin that let the boy in him show. "You were just a better player." He looked at Emily. "Don't let your mom know I said that." My mother shared a story I had never heard before. The night I was forced to leave, she stood in the dark kitchen and pressed her hand against the window above the sink, trying to feel my presence in the yard. "I wanted to run out after you," she said, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on the past. "I wanted to scoop you up and bring you back inside, like a little girl who had fallen off her bike. I didn't, because I believed it was my godly duty to support my husband. I was mistaken about what God asked of me." She squeezed my fingers. "I am trying to be braver now." My father stared at his hands for a long time, then raised his head. "I used to believe that forgiveness was something a pastor handed out through a window, like drive-through grace," he said, the ghost of his old cadence softened by a new humility. "Tonight, I see that it's a table you have to set every single day. It's about plates and forks and speaking an honest sentence." He took a deep breath. "I won't ask for something I haven't earned. But if you'll show me where the plates are kept, I will help set the table. I stood up and retrieved the plates. He followed me into the kitchen, his shoulders squared, as if a tangible task would help. We arranged the china side by side, like people laying a small, daily foundation. He placed the forks on the opposite side from where I would have, and I let them be, because sometimes forgiveness is about allowing a fork to be in the wrong place for an evening. Back in the sitting room, the snow had begun to fall in earnest. The flakes grew larger, and the street outside became quiet in a way that makes even grown-ups look out the window like children. The doorbell rang. Emily looked at me and raised an eyebrow. "Right on schedule," she said. She hurried to the foyer and opened the door to the cold. A gust of wind and a flurry of snow followed her back as she carried in a long, narrow box wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. A simple tag in her handwriting read, "For Grandma and Grandpa." My mother's hands shook as she untied the ribbon. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a framed photo collage with 3 pictures side by side. On the left, a grainy image of me at 19 on that bus stop bench, my belly round under a coat that was too thin, my face set against the world. In the center, my commissioning day photo, the one they had just held, now resized and brightened, Emily's dress a vibrant blue, my smile more confident. On the right, a recent picture from our reception last week, me in my uniform, the star gleaming, my mother's hand on my sleeve. My father's head slightly bowed in a display of respect that needed no announcement. Below the photos, Emily had lettered a sentence in ink that had bled slightly at the edges: "Family isn't who never breaks your heart. It's who shows up with the glue." My mother made a sound I will remember for the rest of my life. My father cleared his throat and then abandoned any attempt at composure. Mark stared at the ceiling, blinking rapidly, as if the plaster held the secret to understanding grace. Emily stood between them, her hands folded in the way she did as a child when she wanted to be careful with the world. "Thank you," my mother whispered, touching the glass over my 19-year-old face. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I didn't know how to hold on to you." My father reached for the frame, then stopped, waiting for permission. I nodded. He took it in both hands like a sacred object. We hung the collage in the hallway, where it's impossible to miss on the way to the bathroom. "That's intentional," Emily said with satisfaction. "Everyone has to face the truth eventually." We laughed, not because the line was particularly funny, though it was, but because laughter is how relief finally escapes the body after being held in for too long. We sang carols after that, badly but with genuine feeling. My father's baritone was out of practice but sincere. My mother found the alto harmony she had set aside years ago and slipped back into it like a comfortable old sweater. Mark and Emily took turns missing the high notes on "O Holy Night," which seemed fitting. Some things are meant to be just a little beyond our grasp. We lit candles and carried them out to the porch, watching the snow land on their paper holders, listening as our town grew quiet and sacred. Before they left, my father paused at the door, his hat in his hand. "I don't deserve this," he said, gesturing to the warmth of the table and the picture on the wall that told the truth without being cruel. I placed my hand on the doorframe, the way one might touch a mezuzah, and said, "None of us do. That's why it's called Christmas." On the porch, we exchanged the hugs of people who have committed to trying again. Their taillights vanished into a white so gentle it felt like a new beginning. Albert closed the gate and came back to their house, snow dusting his shoulders. He tapped his ledger. He said, "Should I make a note that reconciliation is underway?" I smiled. "Yes," I replied, "but use a pencil. We'll make updates as we go." Later, when the house was quiet and the tree was humming, Emily handed me one last envelope with my name on it. Inside was a photo of her at 5, wearing a saucepan as a helmet and saluting me with a wooden spoon. On the back, she had written, "Mom, you taught me that strength is about making room for someone after they've used up their last chance. Merry Christmas." I held the picture to my chest, just as I had held that acceptance letter all those years ago, and thought about how love is a ledger that never balances on paper but somehow always does in the heart. If you have followed this story to its end, especially if you are old enough to have your own box of photographs that smell faintly of time, I hope you will do something that is both simple and difficult: call the person with whom you've been rehearsing an argument and try rehearsing a welcome instead. Share this story with someone who needs a reason to set one more plate at their table. And if our time together has been meaningful to you, I would be grateful if you would subscribe and continue this journey with me. There are more tables to be set, more truths to be told, and more opportunities to choose each other, one ordinary day at a time.